For more on the economic impact of refugees, I sat down with Greg Chen. He's the advocacy director at the American Immigration Lawyers Association. And he began by explaining the difference between migrants and refugees.
Well, first of all, it's important to distinguish the difference between immigrants who are coming here and refugees. Refugees are defined as people who are fleeing from war, violence, and other kinds of persecution. And we've seen the pictures in the news, everybody's seen that, of particularly Syrian refugees who are fleeing by the millions. It's essentially over half the Syrian nation's population has either fled inside their country or has left their country. And they're seeking protection, those who have left their country, in other places now. And the solution there that the United States and many other countries have come to is to make sure that our humanitarian aid is adequate. And the situation we face here in the U.S. is very different because they aren't coming to our borders. They can't walk across the Atlantic Ocean. Other countries have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands coming. We are much more selective through our federal government program that resettles refugees here.
So a lot of people don't understand this vetting process. I'm sure you've looked into this. How does the vetting process work?
So I'm glad you asked that question. And the important thing to realize is that the Syrian refugees that we see on the news today that are walking across borders, they would never be able to arrive on our shores in anything less than a couple of years. Our refugee resettlement program is life-saving, but it is slow and takes a very long time because the vetting process is so thorough. You will be reviewed by UN agencies as well as international organizations overseas and screened. Then the US government has its own officers screen you overseas, and you're run through a whole series of national intelligence and security databases that are screened through several US agencies, including the FBI, before you'd be cleared to be brought here. And you are cleared for all those security purposes. If there's any iota of concern that you would be a risk or a danger, you're automatically out. There's very little tolerance for any kind of threat. And then after essentially 2 years, you might be picked to come over here. What I like to describe it as is essentially a near mission impossible for a refugee to arrive here in the United States. And it's because it's so thorough and there's no certainty that you would get resettled.
So what do you tell those? And there's a lot of people out there who are scared. Let's be honest, they're scared. They may not have access to the information that you, of course, have. And they say, look, I don't want refugees in this country because I'm worried that one of them is going to get in here. One terrorist is going to get in here. And it borders sometimes, I think, on racism. It sometimes is unfair that you're going to generalize it against an entire group of individuals. What do you tell those who say, I don't want them in this country, period?
Well, I say two things to folks. And first of all, it's important to recognize and acknowledge that when people see the violent acts that have happened in our world and recently in Paris and Beirut, those are very real concerns that should not be brushed aside. But with respect to refugees and what should be done about refugees that could come here to the United States, first of all, those coming here, it's very small in number because our vetting is so thorough. In the history of the U.S. refugee program, there hasn't been a single reported act of terrorism committed by a refugee. So that's just one indicator of how low the risk is. And then we really need to look at our nation's history. We're founded on the premise of protecting and welcoming those who have fled. It is a humanitarian, compassionate concern. And when I look at the photographs and the news coverage of people who are fleeing, I understand that Americans are moved by that same compassionate desire to help protect those people. And these refugees are fleeing war. It's frightening for them. And that's why the United States has stood by this. And Americans stand by that principle.
What is the economic benefit to countries like Lebanon? Some of the Middle East countries as well have taken in quite a few refugees, including Turkey, I might add. Is there an economic benefit, or is that something far too difficult to calculate?
For any particular country, I think it is hard to calculate right now. I think an important distinction to just make clear is that small countries like Lebanon and Turkey as well, in comparison to the United States, they have taken on so many more refugees than the United States ever would take on. I think for Lebanon and Turkey, it will be a challenge for them to be able to absorb those refugees into their country. But I think the expectation is that they would only be temporarily staying in their countries, and eventually they'll go back to Syria when the conditions improve. In the United States, last year, we resettled just over 2,000 Syrian refugees overall for the whole country of the United States. So that's a very, very tiny number that we're talking about. And yeah, refugees have contributed historically. Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State, Albert Einstein, those are both well-known refugees. I wouldn't expect refugees to come and be ready to be leaders of our state or the economy, but many of them have done so. And the important thing to realize is that our program, the refugee program to bring them here, is based on actually the humanitarian concerns that I think Americans really support when they see that need of families that are fleeing.
Good stuff, Greg. Thank you very much.